The Sweatfest, or more formally known as the 2v2 Alpha, has come to an end, and I think it had a bit of a mixed reception. On the one hand, it represented some really interesting gunplay and gameplay mechanics that Call of Duty Modern Warfare has. And on the other hand, I feel as though some people felt as though the kind of caliber of 2v2 gameplay wasn't what they were really feeling, and are more interested in seeing some of the larger domination modes, and certainly some of the larger player count modes as well. So all in all, it was a really interesting experience, but that's not to say that there were some hiccups and bumps along the way, and in this video today I'm going to be going through all the issues I found in the 2v2 Alpha and what needs to be fixed. Now some of them do already have announcements for fixes like Footsteps, but I'm still going to bring them up anyway just for the sake of having a list. So to start with, hit registration. Now this has become a bit of an issue because I've noticed that some of my games I felt really solid in terms of gunplay, and then other games felt, well, terrible, and there's really no way to describe why that's happening, but my presumption is that it's actually matchmaking too heavily with people from the United States. Now, some people I played against were clearly American, either through microphone use or just checking out their profile, and being matchmaked onto US East servers isn't necessarily a bad thing, but US West / US Central and beyond is definitely a problem. European matchmaking should stay in Europe and vice versa, and in order to get the best kind of gunplay experiences, we definitely need people to be matchmaked into their own regions. Now we don't have a problem with playing against Americans or playing with people from other regions, but in terms of the best netcode and online and hit registration experience, we need as close as humanly possible with the lowest possible pings. I feel like a lot of you guys experienced during the alpha that some games you felt like your shots were landing perfectly and everything was going smoothly, and other games felt a little bit off. And ironically, when I was over in Germany at Gamescom playing 2v2, now admittedly it was a newer build by a few months, but ultimately it was because it was a closed loop server. There was no ping delay or anything, no issues in terms of hit registration, and everything felt perfect. It felt insanely good how smooth and precise everything ran on that closed loop server where it was just us guys playing 2v2. And I feel as though with closer matchmaking with regions, things like that will get solved, and I really do hope that we at least get to pick the primary region we're match made into and a backup region like US East. What else needs addressing? Well, Footsteps for a star is something. Now this is something that has come up and it's something that supposedly will be fixed in the beta build, but I definitely noticed that the build at Gamescom Footsteps seemed much more vivid, and at least positionally a bit more clear. I think the problem really is that whilst the footstep volume in some places is bad, it's more about the clarity of the footstep itself. Like I need to know whether they're sprinting, whether they're walking, is that coming from the left or right, what surface are they running on. Like it was really difficult to tell if they were running on the wooden central ground, for example, in Operation King, or if they were stepping on the concrete below. And what was really crazy in a lot of instances was that sometimes somebody would push really aggressively and you wouldn't even hear them. You'd have like zero recollection or understanding that they'd made that push in the first place, and that is something that absolutely can't happen. Now I feel as though 2v2 isn't exactly the best representation of Footsteps because it's actually a bit of a counterproductive thing. So on the one hand, for example, you do want Footsteps to work in a certain manner, and you think that in the larger game modes especially, you need to understand audio-wise where people are coming from. But on the flip side of that, as somebody who was using a headset for this, when Footsteps were working, it was actually almost too easy to positionally identify where somebody was, and in a 2v2 arena, that becomes a bit of a problem, because if you can pinpoint where people are just from them walking around, well then people are going to stop walking, and people are going to stop moving. And in a lot of situations, I actually felt as though moving would compromise my location and position, because it was just so easy to hear somebody coming at your direction in some scenarios. So I really do hope that they find some kind of middle ground, or maybe it is the case that 2v2 needs a bit of a change in terms of how Footsteps work to compensate for the uniqueness of the mode, but we'll have to wait and see. Something else that I definitely would like to see is more settings available to console players. Things like being able to adjust to stick dead zones and things like an FOV slider would definitely come in handy, because at the moment things just feel far too zoomed in. And another real issue I have with this is that if crossplay is going to be a thing, then it would make sense for me as a player to get on my PC, get higher graphics, get a higher FOV and a better refresh rate, and play with a control pad and be completely superior to anybody else I'm playing against. against. Now that's not a situation I really want to endure, or a situation that I feel should happen. I feel as though console players, regardless of the situations at hand and in terms of hardware limitations, desperately need that ability to get a higher field of view, otherwise there'll be a huge disadvantage when playing against players who are on PC using a controller, or if that should even be an option at all. I kind of feel as though in some cases crossplay is actually going to promote more problems than it did good. Another issue I'm finding is that there certainly is a layer of visual recoil on some of these weapons. Now, some of them most certainly do have just flat out recoil patterns, but there also has been a combined combination of visual recoil as well. Now, for those of you who remember old school Battlefield days, this was a huge problem because visual recoil isn't really the best representation of what's actually happening with the recoil pattern on screen. And you can see with some of the guns, they kick so heavily visually speaking, it's actually really hard to understand and control the pattern that's being presented to you. I would rather have a much more aggressive recoil that isn't visually represented, just a pure raw input recoil system, as opposed to any kind of visual recoil that's being promoted on screen. This system exists in Battlefield 5 at the moment, where there is no visual recoil on any of the weapons, and it makes it so much better to understand and control your weapons, and I really do feel as though this is something that Modern Warfare should make a change for. Another problem I noticed as well is actually some real inconsistencies surrounding smoke grenades. This is something that I feel as though became a bit of an issue because obviously if one person is seeing one thing on one screen and another person isn't, that's a competitive advantage or disadvantage. And there were some scenarios, especially on both Reddit and one that I certainly encountered as well, where I threw a smoke grenade and I saw the smoke grenade, but the other person didn't. Now, however that is being managed in the game, be that client side, server side, or whatever in between, it certainly needs to be 100% certain that nobody is encountering these situations where somebody is seeing one thing and another person isn't. That will become incredibly frustrating and certainly something you don't want in any kind of competitive environment. And finally, one of the biggest issues I had were the character models in the game. Now that's not to say there were anything wrong with them, but sometimes the movement and animations that they had didn't actually match up to what the player was doing. So a good example would be, you know, somebody who was like crouched behind a wall who looked like he was looking to the right. It turns out he was looking right at me. Like his head model wasn't actually facing the right correct direction. And there were some other issues as well in terms of like character models just doing stuff that didn't seem to align with what you were inputting on screen. But another big issue I have is the exposure to walls, and this is something that certainly does need to be worked on, because for example, if I'm crouched behind a wall and visually speaking from my head it appears that I'm crouched behind a wall, if there is somehow a small section of my body that is exposed beyond the wall, that shouldn't be the case. My character model shouldn't cause that issue. And there were some times where I felt as though I was behind cover, but in fact I actually wasn't, and that is not something you really want in a first-person shooter. And actually, finally, this was a huge problem. There should be no head glitching in this game. The fact that this exists in 2019 is a huge issue, and I really do feel as though it needs to be fixed. Some of it was incredibly extreme, and I really do hope they take the Battlefield 4 approach where bullets come out of the barrel instead of bullets coming out of your eyeballs. This is a huge issue that shouldn't be in any competitive shooter, and it's absolutely paramount that there is no kind of issue of head glitching when this game finally releases. So folks, that's it from me today, TheTacticalBrit. What issues did you have in the 2v2 alpha? And bearing in mind, of course, this is a 2v2 alpha release. It's a very old build and lots of stuff either has been fixed or changes will be made. So let me know what your feedback is in the comment section below. And as always, leave a like, a subscribe, and a notification bell if you want to see some more. As always, folks, thank you for watching, and I'll see you again in another video.